The relationship between politicians and the press is very much in the headlines today, but that's hardly a new relationship or a new thing. The two of us, politicians and the press, have always needed each other. They always will. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's one that's always had its tensions. Stanley Baldwin, a prime minister in the 20s and 30s, attacked the newspaper barons and newspaper owners of his day as wanting power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot or the prostitute down the ages. So we often have some quite florid language used to describe this relationship. Which party in the relationship is more powerful? Well, I think traditionally it was the politicos rather than the journos. In the 60s and 70s, I'm old enough to remember TV interviewers asking our country's leader, "Is there anything you'd like to say today, Prime Minister?" Somehow I don't think that would happen today. In fact, today the relationship may have tilted too far in the opposite direction. The press may have rather abused its power. As I'll describe later, the politicians may be out to tilt the balance back in their favour. There's certainly less respect for politicians from journalists, less deference than journalists used to show politicians. I remember when I was a trainee journalist on local newspapers, we were sometimes told that the right relationship between a journalist and a politician is like the one between a dog and a lamppost. People like me are the dogs and the politicians are the lamppost. As one of my colleagues said, once put it, I'm quoting now, "Dogs don't lick lampposts, they don't jump with joy, or marvel at the light that the lampposts shine, or sleep next to them." Although I have to say, it's been known for a few journalists to sleep next to politicians. As it's early in the morning, I won't go any further into that. My colleague describing the relationship continued, "When dogs see a lamppost, they approach it, sniff it with deep suspicion. Then they leave their mark on it and carry on doing their business." It's been a long time since I came to this part of the world. I'm a long-term inmate of the institution across the road, Parliament, where I've worked for 30 years as a journalist. And during that time, the relationship has changed, sadly, I think, for the worse. And both sides, the politicians and the journalists, are to blame for that. I believe that several British newspapers have taken on the role of players on the political stage rather than just spectators and analysts and observers. There's nothing new about right-leaning newspapers leading the opposition to a Labour left-wing government, especially if they perceive the official Conservative opposition to be rather feeble. But it's become more open and more strident in recent years. It's true that the majority of our newspapers here are Conservative-leaning. They can also be critical of Conservative or Conservative-led governments. And one interesting thing at the moment during your time here is that a lot of the Conservative newspapers don't really like the coalition because it includes another party, i.e. the Liberal Democrats. They'd much prefer to have a Conservative-only government rather than a Conservative-led one, sharing power with the third party, the Liberal Democrats. In contrast, the liberal-minded papers, like The Guardian and my own newspaper, The Independent, tend to be a bit more even-handed. When I joined the Parliamentary Lobby Journalists, a group of journalists based at Westminster back in 1982, I remember the old hands, the veteran journalists there, passing down a kind of tablet of stone to me, and the quote went as follows, left-wing journalists bend over backwards to be fair to the right-wing Conservative Party, and right-wing journalists bend over backwards to be fair to the Conservative Party as well. It's a light-hearted rule, but it has actually stood the test of time. British newspapers have always espoused a political line in their editorial comment, but in recent times I think they've become much more partisan, much more opinionated, and the dividing line between comment and news has become blurred, in some cases almost invisible. In particular, the right-leaning quality newspapers have become, frankly, more likely to edit the facts to suit their own agenda than they were 10, 20 years ago. As a whole, therefore, the press has become less reliable, less honest, and less balanced, something I regret. The expansion of television, notably through the 24-hour news channels, BBC Live and Sky News, have forced a declining, highly competitive newspaper industry to look for a new role. Most members of the public get much of their information about politics from TV news bulletins these days, so the press has decided it needs to shout louder and louder to get their attention. It sadly often appears more interested in providing infotainment than information. The televisual age was epitomised when we had the first ever TV debates between the three main party leaders at our last general election in 2010. The newspapers, as soon as one TV debate was over, were looking forward to the next one, and the TV debates completely eclipsed normal routine election coverage in the newspapers. But despite the tumbling sales of the newspapers, they still matter to politicians, not least because the broadcasters often follow up what the newspapers are writing about, and the papers can still set the agenda for the way politics is covered by the broadcasters. So governments and political parties devote increasing amounts of time and energy to try and influence what people like me write, the way politics is covered in the papers. The game that's played out between the media and the politicians is getting faster and faster. The 24-hour news channels were followed by the expansion of websites, blogs, Twitter. In my own mind, I sometimes imagine two groups constantly chasing each other's tail in an increasingly frantic dance that sometimes must leave the public rather bemused. As the press seeks a new role, I believe most papers have sadly crossed a line between scepticism about politicians, which is healthy in a democracy, and cynicism about them, which is not healthy. For example, the Daily Telegraph was right to expose a couple of years ago the abuses in the system by which MPs claimed their expenses and parliamentary allowances. But I fear that the feeding frenzy since then has gone too far and risks damaging the political system by fueling public hostility and a dangerous lack of trust. Today's politicians certainly don't deserve the deference of a bygone age. The press plays and must continue to play a vital role in holding them to account. But they do deserve perhaps a little more respect than they get from many newspapers. While saying that they are acting in the public interest, some papers risk undermining it. And I fear that the way politics is covered by some papers today will actually discourage some of the brightest and best people here from going into politics, notably from the business world. That would only accelerate the trend towards a political class of advisors turned MPs turned government ministers with little experience of the outside world, which I don't think would serve the public well. Just a little bit on how and why the relationship has changed in the last 20 years. What happened, I think, goes back to the early 1990s when the Labour Party, led by Neil Kinnock, was given a very hard time by the tabloids in this country, and he was subjected to some very nasty personal attacks by Conservative newspapers. When Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party in 1994, he and his colleagues in the new Labour section of the party, which had taken control of it, said this could never happen again. They did not want to have the Kinnock treatment. Mr. Blair once said memorably, when talking about the media, "It's better to ride the tiger's back than let it rip your throat out." I don't know why we always use such colourful language, but obviously the relationship just produced some rather emotive phrases at times. What Blair was talking about was rebuilding contacts with Rupert Murdoch's newspapers, who had a very strained relationship with the Labour Party. It was understandable while Labour was in opposition and wanted to win the next election, and it worked because The Sun, the biggest selling newspaper in this country, owned by Rupert Murdoch, did literally come out for Labour in 1997, which was a very landmark moment in that campaign. What was wrong, I think, was to continue those close links when Labour was in power from 1997, running the government. One of Blair's officials, Lance Price, once said, later, not while he was working there, no big decision could ever made inside number 10 Downing Street without taking account of the likely reaction of three men: Gordon Brown, the Chancellor, John Prescott, the Deputy Labour leader, and the other one was Rupert Murdoch. A good example of the power that somebody outside politics in the media can influence what goes on inside politics. New Labour's determination to avoid the treatment given out to Neil Kinnock in the early 90s led to a very different, some would say, ruthless approach to managing the news, with the full blessing of Tony Blair himself. As some of you who are journalists will know, you can never stop politicians or businessmen or anybody handing out stories and interviews like sweeties to favoured newspapers or trusted journalists, and it would be silly to try. But what became known in this country as a new culture of spin involved much more pressure on journalists to toe the line of the spin doctors, the press officers, the media managers working for politicians. There were more rewards and punishment and complaints to editors if they didn't like what people wrote in the newspapers. There were selective briefings to a favoured few journalists rather than a more even-handed approach. It wasn't intended to give the winners a commercial advantage, but it was intended to secure the most favourable coverage. Interestingly, the approach that Tony Blair's New Labour movement took was copied and envied by the Conservatives when David Cameron became their leader in opposition in 2005. And it's striking if you look back at the tactics he used both to win power and then, since he's been exercising power 2 years ago, his tactics is very much based on the kind of New Labour playbook.